Video recommendation. This video, which you can see on screen right now, is an IFL interview with Isaac Chamberlain, and it is one of the most insightful boxing interviews you will ever see. It gives an excellent insight into the psychology of a fighter in the lead up to a fight, and it also gives an insight into some of the things that can go wrong in training camp in the lead up to a fight. In this interview, Isaac Chamberlain details what went wrong in the lead up to his showdown with Lawrence Okolie. Now, before I go further, I'm sounding like Dwyer here. Before I go further, I am not here to tell you that if those things hadn't gone wrong in Isaac Chamberlain's training camp, that he would have beaten Lawrence Okolie. I'm not here to tell you that whatsoever. All I'm here to tell you is that Isaac Chamberlain wasn't at his best, but who's to say that his best would have been good enough to beat Lawrence Okolie? It may well not have been. There are plenty of fighters who go into fights 100% at their best and they still lose. And at the same time, there are plenty of fighters who go into fights and they're not at their best and they still win. At the end of the day, if someone is levels above you, then there's very little you can do to address that issue. Peter McNeely, no matter what approach he took, was never going to beat Mike Tyson. Okay, so understand me and be clear about what I'm saying here. Going forward, Isaac Chamberlain can learn lessons from what took place in the training camp for Lawrence Okolie. Not because he's going to beat Okolie in the future, no, but because he needs to learn how to get the best out of himself. Being at his absolute best is not going to allow him to beat everybody, but when he comes up against somebody of a similar level to himself, being at his absolute best can make the difference between winning and losing. Because when you're coming up against someone of a similar level to yourself, the margin of error is very small. So the slightest little advantage you can get, the slightest little small things you can tweak in training camp, the psychological advantages, etc., when you're closely matched with someone, that can make the difference between winning and losing. So these are the lessons Isaac Chamberlain needs to learn. And clearly from the interview, he is trying to learn those lessons. Now, he talks about what went wrong from a psychological point of view. And he also talks about what went wrong from a physical point of view. First of all, I want to tackle what went wrong physically in Isaac Chamberlain's training camp. It's very clear that based on what Isaac Chamberlain says in the interview, he overtrained. Overtraining is a very, very real phenomenon. It is something which lots of fighters do, but I think a lot of fighters don't realize they're overtraining. A lot of trainers don't realize they're overtraining their fighters. Overtraining is something people like Courtney Shand talked about. There's a documentary with Lennox Lewis where Courtney Shand talks about, Courtney Shand was Lennox Lewis's strength and conditioning coach for many years. And he talked about peaking at the right time and not overtraining your fighter so when they get in the ring, they've got nothing left. Errol Spence recently talked about overtraining. He said, one of the interviewers who was in his camp said, "Wow, you have got an incredible work ethic. Do you train like this all year round?" And he said, "Absolutely not. If I train like this all year round, I'd burn myself out." Overtraining. Okay? Many other fighters have talked about it. George Groves talked about having sufficient rest. This is what people need to understand. A lot of the time, overtraining can be even worse than undertraining. Rest is just as important as training hard. You have to get sufficient rest. And not everybody, not every fighter is capable of doing the same amount of training. Not every fighter needs the exact same amount of rest. One of the biggest mistakes that trainers make is applying a one-size-fits-all method to all the fighters they train. In Isaac Chamberlain's instance, he was trained by his uncle, Ted Bammy. Ted Bammy was a welterweight. You cannot train a welterweight the same way you would train a cruiserweight or vice versa, okay? Judging by what Isaac Chamberlain said, Ted Bammy was trying to train Isaac Chamberlain like a welterweight. If you listen, cruiserweights cannot do the kind of training for the most part. There might be some rare exceptions, but for the most part, cruiserweights cannot do the kind of training that your average welterweight could do. The average welterweight is going to be able to train harder than a big guy like a cruiserweight. So you cannot, as a trainer, expect a cruiserweight to do the same things a welterweight does in training camp. Ridiculous. So it appears that Isaac Chamberlain was overtrained, and he details how it felt being overtrained. He talks about feeling knackered, but then being pushed on and pushed on and pushed on without any kind of rest days or anything, and thinking in his head, well, it's okay, I'll feel alright by the time fight night comes. I'll feel alright when fight night comes. Don't worry about it. I know I feel terrible now, but when fight night comes, I'll be okay. But he said in the days leading up to fight night, his energy wasn't there. It was gone. It was depleted. Now, I'm not a doctor. I'm not a sports scientist. I can't tell you in scientific terms exactly what goes on when you overtrain. All I know is I overtrained many times when I was boxing. So I understand how you feel. And I also understand that doing too much intense cardiovascular training week after week after week, it can actually lead to your testosterone levels dropping. This can happen. And again, not everybody's body reacts in the same way to the same training. You could put someone else through the exact same training as Isaac Chamberlain, and they wouldn't burn out. They wouldn't be overtrained. Everybody's body doesn't react in the same way. So as a fighter, you have to know your body and know what works for you. And as a trainer, you have to know your fighter and have to know when to ease up and give him rest days, etc., etc. Robert McCracken has talked about this with Anthony Joshua, is getting the training camp down to a fine science, giving him the right amount of rest days to recuperate so he doesn't overtrain, so his body isn't depleted by the time the fight comes around. You see? And so Isaac Chamberlain, again, in this interview, these are the things he's talking about. He's talking about how he felt physically in the lead up to the fight. And he basically said that by the time fight night came, he was running on fumes. He didn't have anything left to give. He'd left it all in a training camp. He'd trained so flipping hard with such little rest. They hadn't timed the training right to where he peaked at the right time. That's what it's all about in training camp. Getting your fighter to peak on the night of the fight. Yeah, a lot of the time when it comes to overtraining, you're talking about a guy peaking too early in training camp. And after he's peaked, then it's a steep slope downwards. And he's going to need, personally for me, the times when I overtrained, I would need at least a week, sometimes more, to get my energy levels back to where they normally would be. A week of no training at all. None. Just eating loads of food and not training. I would need all that to get back. And it was okay for me to do things like that because I was a super heavyweight. For Isaac Chamberlain, he's a cruiserweight. Anybody cruiserweight and below, not only do they have to worry about, peaking too early, overtraining, etc., they also have to worry about making weight. So as well as trying to peak at the right time and get enough rest, they're also trying to keep their weight down, which is kind of a conflict of interest because keeping your weight down means you're going to have to train closer and closer to the actual fight. Whereas if you're a heavyweight, or in the amateurs a super heavyweight, you don't have to worry about what your weight is. So, you can refuel and order food you want to have and get as much rest as you want to get without having to worry about your weight going up because there is no weight to make. So anyway, that is one of the most insightful things about the interview is him talking about the fact that he overtrained, the fact that he was forced by his trainer to overtrain. Again, you have to understand your fighter physically, what he needs. He's not going to respond exactly the same way as someone else you might have trained, particularly if he's a different weight. Yeah? The other aspect that Isaac Chamberlain talked about, and these two things are kind of interlinked, but the other aspect was the psychological aspect. Now, once again, just like with the physical, you have to know your fighter. Every fighter is not going to react the same way psychologically in the same circumstances. They're going to react differently. We all have different personalities. We all have different things that might unnerve us or bother us or anger us or make us feel a certain way. So again, it's crucial for a trainer to know his fighter psychologically and know what the fighter requires in order to perform to the best of his ability. Know what his fighter requires in terms of an environment. Creating an environment around the fighter which is conducive to the fighter producing their best. Isaac Chamberlain, I noticed this a long time ago, is quite a quiet individual. He's not a typical alpha male. You know, if you look at Lawrence Okolie, he's far more alpha than Isaac Chamberlain is. And so you've got a guy like Isaac who maybe is a little bit too polite for his own good sometimes. And I think he mentioned that in the interview. He's a little too polite for his own good. He's a kind of quiet, reserved person. And so as a trainer, you need to understand where Isaac is at mentally and understand what he needs. Now, the mental aspect of boxing is especially important when you're dealing with inexperienced fighters like this. If you're dealing with a Mayweather and Pacquiao, you don't need to worry about the fighter too much psychologically because they've been there, they've seen it, and they've done it all. So you ain't got to really worry. But when you're dealing with inexperienced guys, you need to be paying very careful attention to your fighter, making sure he's in the right environment to put him in the right place mentally. Okay, these inexperienced guys haven't felt the pressure before. And there was a lot of pressure on Isaac Chamberlain and on Lawrence Okolie. Isaac actually admits that the things Lawrence was saying about him prior to the fight were actually true. Lawrence was saying that Isaac has got a bunch of hangers-on around him, a bunch of cheerleaders, a bunch of ignorant people. This is what Lawrence said prior to the fight, and Isaac was now admitting in this interview that what Lawrence said was true. That he did have a bunch of hangers-on. He had a bunch of people who really didn't know anything about boxing. They were just trying to ride the Isaac Chamberlain wave. They were just trying to be in selfies with Isaac in a changing room and in Nando's and all this kind of stuff. Parasites, basically. And these parasites were not allowing Isaac to put the goggles on and have tunnel vision. They were distracting him from focusing on the fight. And again, these things can affect an inexperienced fighter especially. A more experienced guy, it may not affect him. But an inexperienced guy, it can affect him. For example, Muhammad Ali, who is a very outgoing, gregarious, alpha male type character, when he was in Zaire, what we call the Congo today, where Isaac Chamberlain actually is from, where his family's from, when Ali fought Foreman over there, he was with the people. He was among the people. He was running with people in the streets and doing all kind of media stuff and etc., because he was an experienced guy. He's used to being in the spotlight. He was used to pressure. So having all those potential distractions around him didn't really affect him. But when you're dealing with a different personality type, like an Isaac Chamberlain, who's inexperienced, having all these hangers on and people around and people take it, that can affect you in a negative way and it can throw your focus off. And again, it's not to say that if Isaac Chamberlain had had the perfect camp, he would have beat Lawrence Okolie. No, these are lessons Isaac Chamberlain needs to learn moving forward for future fights against different opponents. Forget about Lawrence Okolie for now. Okay? It's just about understanding how to get the best out of yourself. Yeah? And however far your best takes you, who knows? But yeah, there were lots of hangers-on distracting Isaac Chamberlain, and his trainer or former trainer and uncle Ted Bammy allowed all this stuff to happen. In the dressing room before the fight, there was, I think Isaac said, like 10 or 20 people who he didn't even know. Just random Congolese people and hangers-on who he didn't know in the changing room. And there were little kids in there as well, like playing ping pong and kicking stuff around. And it was just a chaotic atmosphere. And Isaac said I didn't need to be in a chaotic atmosphere. I needed to be in a quiet atmosphere so I could focus my mind. Whereas Ted Bammy, it appears, did a terrible job of creating an environment which would be conducive to Isaac producing his best form. So by the time Isaac got to the ring, he said he was tired. He didn't have his energy there. He wasn't focused because the environment that he was in backstage and in the lead up to the fight wasn't really allowing him to focus. Do you understand? There were lots of different factors at play. But hey, he may well have still lost to Lawrence Okolie anyway. I'm sure Lawrence Okolie wasn't 100% psychologically or in training camp. You know? But maybe he's just better than Isaac Chamberlain. Maybe he deals with certain things psychologically better than Isaac Chamberlain. He's certainly a more ostensibly confident character. A more ostensibly alpha male type character than Isaac Chamberlain. You know, but the thing is, if I was somebody training Isaac Chamberlain, if I was somebody in his corner, I would be paying very careful attention to Isaac psychologically, trying to understand what he needs psychologically, what he understands physically, what he needs physically from a training perspective. These are the things I'd be paying very, very careful attention to, just being diligent as a trainer, but also understanding I'm dealing with an inexperienced fighter who's going through things for the first time, things he's never been through before. And so if you've got a guy who's maybe not quite as psychologically in command as a Lawrence Okolie, there are certain things you can do to compensate for that. Certain things you can do for your fighter to compensate for him not being quite as psychologically robust as a Lawrence Okolie. You understand? And thirdly, just to close out, Isaac Chamberlain talks about one of the other things, the sad things which goes on in boxing, and that is unscrupulous individuals who will try to relieve a fighter of their money. And in this case, the unscrupulous individual was Isaac Chamberlain's own uncle and now former trainer Ted Bammy, who Isaac has accused of basically stealing from him, taking £10,000 out of his fight purse and lying about it. And it wasn't until Isaac got proof from Matchroom Boxing that the money had been paid into Ted Bammy's account. It wasn't until that happened and Isaac showed Ted Bammy the proof that Ted Bammy admitted that he did take the money, because all along he'd been lying and saying he didn't take it and it was some kind of mistake on Matchroom's behalf. He eventually, according to Isaac Chamberlain, admitted it. And from that point on, Isaac locked him off, and he's going through the British Border Boxing Control channel as a way of trying to get the money back from his uncle. He's obviously not with Ted Bammy anymore. He's with a new coach. So yeah, have a watch of the interview. Fantastic, very, very insightful interview into what goes on in a fighter's head, what goes on in training camp, the things that can affect a fighter. And once again, I don't want to hear from the one-size-fits-all police. I don't want to hear from the people who say, well, I've been in that situation, it didn't affect me. Every fighter is not the same psychologically. And also you're going to get people saying, oh, he's just making excuses for him losing. Fighters are not robots, people. I don't know if you're aware of this. And most of the people who say this kind of thing have never laced up a pair of gloves in their lives. Yeah? Fighters are not robots. Psychological things can and do affect them, particularly when they're inexperienced. Yeah? People acting as though nothing can affect a fighter. An injury can't affect him. You know, nothing, no psychological factors can affect him. It's all just excuses and it's all nonsense. No, it's not all nonsense. You've clearly never boxed if you think that it's all nonsense. These things do affect fighters to varying degrees depending on the fighter. So anyway, have a watch of the interview. Very, very insightful. Drop your comments in the comment section below. Let me know how you feel. It's happening. I'm out.